to the Senate and House of Representatives. I have the honor to transmit herewith a letter, accompanied by testimony, addressed to me by Honorable John Sherman and other distinguished citizens in regard to the canvass of the vote for electors in the state of Louisiana. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, December 14, 1876. To the House of Representatives. In answer to a resolution of the 7th instant of the House of Representatives, asking to be informed whether any and what negotiations have or are being made with the Sioux Indians for their removal to the Indian Territory, and under what authority the same has been and is being done, I submit herewith a report received from the Secretary of the Interior, which contains, it is believed, all the information in possession of his department touching the matter of the resolution. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, December 14, 1876. To the Senate of the United States. In answer to the resolution of the Senate of the 6th instant, requesting information as to whether troops of the United States were stationed at the city of Petersburg in the state of Virginia on the 7th of November, 1876, and if so, under what authority and for what purpose, I submit the enclosed letters from the Secretary of War, to whom the resolution was referred, together with the report of the General of the Army and accompanying papers. These enclosures will give all the information called for by the resolution, and I confidently believe will justify the action taken. It is well understood that the presence of United States troops at polling places never prevented the free exercise of the franchise by any citizen, of whatever political faith. If, then, they have had any effect whatever upon the ballot cast, it has been to ensure protection to the citizen casting it, in giving it to the candidate of his unbiased choice, without fear, and thus securing the very essence of liberty. It may be the presence of 24 United States soldiers, under the command of a captain and lieutenant, quartered in the custom house at Petersburg, Virginia, on the 7th of November, at a considerable distance from any polling place, without any interference on their part whatever, and without going near the polls during the election, may have secured a different result from what would have been obtained if they had not been there, to maintain the peace in case of riot, on the face of the returns. But if such is the case, it is only proof that in this one congressional district in the state of Virginia the legal and constitutional votes have been able to return as elected the candidate of their choice. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, December 22, 1876. To the Senate and House of Representatives. I have the honor to transmit herewith a letter submitted by the Secretary of the Interior from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, accompanied by the report and journal of proceedings of the commission appointed on the 24th day of August last to obtain certain concessions from the Sioux Indians, in accordance with the provisions contained in the Indian Appropriation Act for the current fiscal year. I ask your special consideration of these articles of agreement, as among other advantages to be gained by them is the clear right of citizens to go into a country of which they have taken possession and from which they cannot be excluded. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, December 22, 1876. To the Senate and House of Representatives. I have the honor to transmit herewith a report and papers which accompanied it of the progress of the work committed to their charge, addressed to me by the commissioners appointed under the Act of Congress approved July 19, 1876, authorizing the repavement of Pennsylvania Avenue. U.S. Grant. Washington, December 23, 1876. To the House of Representatives. When Congress adjourned in August last, the execution of the extradition article of the treaty of 1842 between the United States and Great Britain had been interrupted. The United States had demanded of Her Majesty's government the surrender of certain fugitives from justice charged with crimes committed within the jurisdiction of the United States, who had sought asylum and were found within the territories of Her British Majesty, and had, in due compliance with the requirements of the treaty, furnished the evidence of the criminality of the fugitives, which had been found sufficient to justify their apprehension and commitment for trial, as required by the treaty, and the fugitives were held and committed for extradition. Her Majesty's government, however, demanded from the United States certain assurances or stipulations as a condition for the surrender of these fugitives. As the treaty contemplated no such conditions to the performance of the obligations which each government had assumed, the demand for stipulations on the part of this government was repelled. Her Majesty's government thereupon, in June last, released two of the fugitives, Ezra D. Winslow and Charles J. Brent, and subsequently released a third, one William E. Gray, and, refusing to surrender, set them at liberty. In a message to the two Houses of Congress on the 20th day of June last, in view of the condition of facts as above referred to, I said: "The position thus taken by the British government, if adhered to, cannot but be regarded as the abrogation and annulment of the article of the treaty on extradition. Under these circumstances it will not, in my judgment, comport with the dignity or self-respect of this government to make demands upon that government for the surrender of fugitive criminals, nor to entertain any requisition of that character from that government under the treaty. Article 11 of the Treaty of 1842 provided that the 10th article, that relating to extradition, should continue in force until one or the other of the parties should signify its wish to terminate it, and no longer. In view, however, of the great importance of an extradition treaty, especially between two states as intimately connected in commercial and social relations as are the United States and Great Britain, and in the hope that Her Majesty's government might yet reach a different decision from that then attained, I abstained from recommending any action by Congress terminating the extradition article of the treaty. I have, however, declined to take any steps under the treaty toward extradition. It is with great satisfaction that I am able to now announce to Congress and to the country that by the voluntary act of Her Majesty's government the obstacles which had been interposed to the execution of the extradition article of the treaty have been removed. On the 27th of October last, Her Majesty's representative at this capital, under instructions from Lord Derby, informed this government that Her Majesty's government would be prepared, as a temporary measure, until a new extradition treaty can be concluded, to put in force all powers vested in it for the surrender of accused persons to the government of the United States under the Treaty of 1842, without asking for any engagement as to such persons not being tried in the United States for other than the offenses for which the extradition had been demanded. I was happy to greet this announcement as the removal of the obstacles which had arrested the execution of the extradition treaty between the two countries. In reply to the note of Her Majesty's representative, after referring to the applications heretofore made by the United States for the surrender of the fugitives referred to in the correspondence which was laid before Congress in its last session, it was stated that on an indication of readiness to surrender these persons an agent would be authorized to receive them, and I would be ready to respond to requisitions which may be made on the part of Her Majesty's government under the 10th article of the Treaty of 1842, which I would then regard as in full force until such time as either government shall avail itself of the right to terminate it provided by the 11th article, or until a more comprehensive arrangement can be reached between the two governments in regard to the extradition of criminals, an object to which the attention of this government would gladly be given, with an earnest desire for a mutually satisfactory result. A copy of the correspondence between Her Majesty's representative at this capital and the Secretary of State on the subject is transmitted herewith. It is with great satisfaction that I have now to announce that Her Majesty's government, while expressing its desire not to be understood to recede from the interpretation which in its previous correspondence it has put upon the treaty, but having regard to the prospect of a new treaty and the power possessed by either party of spontaneously denouncing the old one, caused the rearrest on the 4th instant of Brent, one of the fugitives who had been previously discharged, and after awaiting the requisite time within which the fugitive is entitled to appeal or to apply for his discharge, on the 21st instant surrendered him to the agent appointed on behalf of this government to receive and to convey him to the United States. Her Majesty's government has expressed an earnest desire to rearrest and to deliver up Winslow and Gray, the other fugitives who had been arrested and committed on the requisition of the United States, but were released because of the refusal of the United States to give the assurances and stipulations then required by Great Britain. These persons, however, are believed to have escaped from British jurisdiction. A diligent search has failed to discover them. As the surrender of Brent, without condition or stipulation of any kind being asked, removes the obstacle which interrupted the execution of the treaty, I shall no longer abstain from making demands upon Her Majesty's government for the surrender of fugitive criminals, nor from entertaining requisitions of that character from that government under the Treaty of 1842, but will again regard the treaty as operative, hoping to be able before long to conclude with Her Majesty's government a new treaty of broader and more comprehensive nature. U.S. Grant. Washington, January 8, 1877. To the House of Representatives. In answer to the resolution of the House of Representatives of the 19th ultimo, I transmit herewith the report of the Secretary of State, together with the papers which accompanied it. U.S. Grant. For message of January 12, 1877, withdrawing objections to Senate Bill No. 561, see pages 389 to 390. Executive Mansion, January 12, 1877. To the House of Representatives. In reply to a resolution of inquiry dated December 23, 1876, of the House of Representatives, respecting the expenditure of certain moneys appropriated by the Act of August 14, 1876, for river and harbor improvements, I have the honor to transmit herewith, for your information, a report and accompanying papers received from the Secretary of War, to whom the resolution was referred. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 15, 1877. To the House of Representatives. The joint resolution authorizing the Secretary of War to supply blankets to the Reform School in the District of Columbia is before me. I am in entire sympathy with the purpose of the resolution, but before taking any action upon it, I deem it my duty to submit for your consideration the accompanying letter, received from the Secretary of War, embodying a report made in anticipation of the passage of the resolution by the Quartermaster General of the Army, in which, among other facts, it is stated that the appropriation for clothing for the Army for this fiscal year is much smaller than usual, and the supply of blankets which it will allow us to purchase is so small that none can properly be spared for any other purposes than the supply of the Army. If it be thought by Congress worth while to cause the supply of blankets for the institution referred to be procured through the War Department, it is respectfully suggested that the provision to meet the expense be made by special appropriation. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 19, 1877. To the House of Representatives. At the request of the Attorney General, I have the honor to transmit herewith a report in answer to the resolution of the House adopted on the 1st of August, 1876, relative to certain matters occurring in the administration of the provisional government of the District of Columbia, and chiefly affecting the Commissioners and the late Board of Audit. U.S. Grant. Washington, January 20, 1877. To the Senate of the United States. Herewith I transmit a report from the Secretary of State, with accompanying papers relating to the Court of Commissioners of Alabama Claims. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 22, 1877. To the House of Representatives. In answer to the resolution of the House of Representatives of the 8th of December last, inquiring whether any increase in the cavalry force of the Army on the Mexican frontier of Texas has been made, as authorized by the act of July 24, 1876, and whether any troops have been removed from the frontier of Texas and from the post of Fort Sill on the Kiowa and Comanche Reservation, and whether, if so, their places have been supplied by other forces, I have the honor to transmit a report received from the Secretary of War. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 22, 1877. To the House of Representatives. On the 9th day of December, 1876, the following resolution of the House of Representatives was received, namely, resolved, that the President be requested, if not incompatible with the public interest, to transmit to this House copies of any and all orders or directions emanating from him or from either of the executive departments of the government to any military commander or civil officer with reference to the service of the Army or any portion thereof in the United States of Virginia, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida since the 1st of August last, together with reports by telegraph or otherwise from either or any of said military commanders or civil officers. It was immediately or soon thereafter referred to the Secretary of War and the Attorney General, the custodians of all retained copies of orders or directions given by the executive departments of the government covered by the above inquiry, together with all information upon which such orders or directions were given. The information, it will be observed, is voluminous, and, with the limited clerical force in the Department of Justice, has consumed the time up to the present. Many of the communications accompanying this have been already made public in connection with messages heretofore sent to Congress. This class of information includes the important documents received from the Governor of South Carolina and sent to Congress with my message on the subject of the Hamburg massacre. Also, the documents accompanying my response to the resolution of the House of Representatives in regard to the soldiers stationed at Petersburg. There have also come to me and to the Department of Justice, from time to time, other earnest written communications from persons holding public trusts and from others residing in the South, some of which I append hereto as bearing upon the precarious condition of the public peace in those states. These communications I have reason to regard as made by respectable and responsible men. Many of them deprecate the publication of their names as involving danger to them personally. The reports heretofore made by committees of Congress of the results of their inquiries in Mississippi and Louisiana, and the newspapers of several states recommending the Mississippi Plan, have also furnished important data for estimating the danger to the public peace and order in those states. It is enough to say that these different kinds and sources of evidence have left no doubt whatever in my mind that intimidation has been used, and actual violence, to an extent requiring the aid of the United States government, where it was practicable to furnish such aid, in South Carolina, in Florida and in Louisiana, as well as in Mississippi and Alabama and in Georgia. The troops of the United States have been but sparingly used, and in no case so as to interfere with the free exercise of the right of suffrage. Very few troops were available for the purpose of preventing or suppressing the violence and intimidation existing in the states above named. In no case, except that of South Carolina, was the number of soldiers in any state increased in anticipation of the election, saving that 24 men and an officer were sent from Fort Foote to Petersburg, Virginia, where disturbances were threatened prior to the election. No troops were stationed at the voting places. In Florida and in Louisiana, respectively, the small number of soldiers already in the said states were stationed at such points in each state as were most threatened with violence, where they might be available as a posse for the officer whose duty it was to preserve the peace and prevent intimidation of voters. Such a disposition of the troops seemed to me reasonable and justified by law and precedent, while its omission would have been inconsistent with the constitutional duty of the President of the United States to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The statute expressly forbids the bringing of troops to the polls, except where it is necessary to keep the peace, implying that to keep the peace it may be done. But this even, so far as I am advised, has not in any case been done. The stationing of a company or part of a company in the vicinity where they would be available to prevent riot has been the only use made of the troops prior to and at the time of the elections. Where so stationed, they could be called in an emergency requiring it by a marshal or deputy marshal as a posse to aid in suppressing unlawful violence. The evidence which has come to me has left no ground to doubt that if there had been more military force available, it would have been my duty to have disposed of it in several states with a view to the prevention of the violence and intimidation which have undoubtedly contributed to the defeat of the election law in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, as well as in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. By Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. By act of Congress, U.S. Revised Statutes, Section 1034, 1035. The President, in case of insurrection in any state, or of unlawful obstruction to the enforcement of the laws of the United States by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, or whenever domestic violence in any state so obstructs the execution of the laws thereof and of the United States as to deprive any portion of the people of such state of their civil or political rights, is authorized to employ such parts of the land and naval forces as he may deem necessary to enforce the execution of the laws and preserve the peace and sustain the authority of the state and of the United States. Acting under this title, 69, of the Revised Statutes, United States, I accompanied the sending of troops to South Carolina with a proclamation such as is therein prescribed. The President is also authorized by act of Congress to employ such part of the land or naval forces of the United States as shall be necessary to prevent the violation and to enforce the due execution of the provisions of Title 24 of the Revised Statutes of the United States for the protection of the civil rights of citizens, among which is the provision against conspiracies to prevent by force, intimidation, or threat any citizen who is lawfully entitled to vote from giving his support or advocacy in a legal manner toward or in favor of the election of any lawfully qualified person as an elector for the President or Vice President or as a member of Congress of the United States. U.S. Revised Statutes, Section 1989. In cases falling under this title, I have not considered it necessary to issue a proclamation to precede or accompany the employment of such part of the Army as seemed to be necessary. In case of insurrection against a state government or against the government of the United States, a proclamation is appropriate. But in keeping the peace of the United States at an election at which members of Congress are elected, no such call from the state or proclamation by the President is prescribed by statute or required by precedent. In the case of South Carolina, insurrection and domestic violence against the state government were clearly shown, and the application of the governor founded thereupon was duly presented, and I could not deny his constitutional request without abandoning my duty as the executive of the national government. The companies stationed in the other states have been employed to secure the better execution of the laws of the United States and to preserve the peace of the United States. After the election had been had, and where violence was apprehended by which the returns from the counties and precincts might be destroyed, troops were ordered to the state of Florida, and those already in Louisiana were ordered to the points in greatest danger of violence. I have not employed troops on slight occasions, nor in any case where it has not been necessary to the enforcement of the laws of the United States. In this I have been guided by the Constitution and the laws which have been enacted and the precedents which have been formed under it. It has been necessary to employ troops occasionally to overcome resistance to the internal revenue laws from the time of the resistance to the collection of the whiskey tax in Pennsylvania, under Washington, to the present time. In 1854, when it was apprehended that resistance would be made in Boston to the seizure and return to his master of a fugitive slave, the troops there stationed were employed to enforce the master's right under the Constitution, and troops stationed at New York were ordered to be in readiness to go to Boston if it should prove to be necessary. In 1859, when John Brown, with a small number of men, made his attack upon Harper's Ferry, the President ordered United States troops to assist in the apprehension and suppression of him and his party without a formal call of the legislature or governor of Virginia and without proclamation of the President. Without citing further instances in which the executive has exercised his power as commander of the Army and Navy to prevent or suppress resistance to the laws of the United States, or where he has exercised like authority in obedience to a call from a state to suppress insurrection, I desire to assure both Congress and the country that it has been my purpose to administer the executive powers of the government fairly, and in no instance to disregard or transcend the limits of the Constitution. U.S. Grant. Washington, January 23, 1877. To the Senate of the United States, I transmit, in answer to a resolution of the Senate of the 16th instant, a report of the Secretary of State with its accompanying papers. U.S. Grant. Washington, January 25, 1877. To the Senate of the United States, I transmit to the Senate, for consideration with a view to ratification, a treaty between the United States and His Majesty King of Spain, in relation to the extradition of criminals, signed on the 5th of January, 1877. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 29, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives, I have the honor to transmit herewith the proceedings of the commission appointed to examine the whole subject of reform and reorganization of the Army of the United States, under the provisions of the Act of Congress approved July 24, 1876. The Commission report that so fully has their time been occupied by other important duties that they are not at this time prepared to submit a plan or make proper recommendations. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 29, 1877. To the House of Representatives. I have the honor to transmit herewith reports and accompanying papers received from the Secretaries of State and War in answer to the resolution of the House of Representatives of the 9th instant, relative to the imprisonment and detention by the Mexican authorities at Matamoras of John J. Smith, an American citizen, and also to the wounding and robbing by Mexican soldiers at New Laredo of Dr. Samuel Huggins, an American citizen. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 29, 1877. To the Senate of the United States. I follow the example heretofore occasionally permitted of communicating in this mode my approval of the Act to provide for and regulate the counting of votes for President and Vice President, and the decision of questions arising thereon, for the term commencing March 4, A.D. 1877, because of my appreciation of the imminent peril to the institutions of the country from which, in my judgment, the act affords a wise and constitutional means of escape. For the first time in the history of our country, under the Constitution as it is now, a dispute exists with regard to the result of the election of the Chief Magistrate of the nation. It is understood that upon the disposition of disputes touching the electoral votes cast at the late election by one or more of the States depends the question whether one or the other of the candidates for the presidency is to be the lawful Chief Magistrate. The importance of having clearly ascertained, by a procedure regulated by law, which of the two citizens has been elected, and of having the right to his high office recognized and cheerfully agreed in by all the people of the Republic, cannot be overestimated, and leads me to express to Congress and to the nation my great satisfaction at the adoption of a measure that affords an orderly means of decision of a gravely exciting question. While the history of our country in its earlier periods shows that the President of the Senate has counted the votes and declared their standing, our whole history shows that in no instance of doubt or dispute has he exercised the power of deciding, and that the two houses of Congress have disposed of all such doubts and disputes, although in no instance hitherto have they been such that their decision could essentially have affected the result. For the first time the government of the United States is now brought to meet the question as one vital to the result, and this under conditions not the best calculated to produce an agreement or to induce calm feeling in the several branches of the government or among the people of the country. In a case where, as now, the result is involved, it is the highest duty of the law-making power to provide in advance a constitutional, orderly, and just method of executing the Constitution in this most interesting and critical of its provisions. The doing so, far from being a compromise of right, is an enforcement of right and an execution of powers conferred by the Constitution on Congress. I think that this orderly method has been secured by the bill, which, appealing to the Constitution and the law as the guide in ascertaining rights, provides the means of deciding questions of single returns through the direct action of Congress, and in respect to double returns by a tribunal of inquiry, whose decisions stand unless both houses of Congress shall concur in determining otherwise, thus securing a definite disposition of all questions of dispute, in whatever aspect they may arise. With or without this law, as all of the States have voted, and as a tie vote is impossible, it must be that one of the two candidates has been elected, and it would be deplorable to witness an irregular controversy as to which of the two should receive or which should continue to hold the office. In all periods of history, controversies have arisen as to the succession or choice of the chiefs of states, and no party or citizens loving their country and its free institutions can sacrifice too much of mere feeling in preserving through the upright course of law their country from the smallest danger to its peace on such an occasion. And it cannot be impressed too firmly in the hearts of all the people that true liberty and real progress can exist only through a cheerful adherence to constitutional law. The bill purports to provide only for the settlement of questions arising from the recent elections. The fact that such questions can arise demonstrates the necessity, which I cannot doubt will before long be supplied, of permanent general legislation to meet cases which have not been contemplated in the Constitution or laws of the country. The bill may not be perfect, and its provisions may not be such as would be best applicable to all future occasions, but it is calculated to meet the present condition of the question and of the country. The country is agitated. It needs and it desires peace and quiet and harmony between all parties and all sections. Its industries are arrested, labor unemployed, capital idle, and enterprise paralyzed by reason of the doubt and anxiety attending the uncertainty of a double claim to the chief magistracy of the nation. It wants to be assured that the result of the election will be accepted without resistance from the supporters of the disappointed candidate, and that its highest officer shall not hold his place with the questioned title of right. Believing that the bill will secure these ends, I give it my signature. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, January 30th, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives. I desire to call the attention of Congress to the importance of providing for the continuance of the board for testing iron, steel, and other metals, which, by the Sundry Civil Appropriation Act of last year, was ordered to be discontinued at the end of the present fiscal year. This board, consisting of engineers and other scientific experts from the Army, the Navy, and from civil life, all of whom, except the Secretary, give their time and labors to this object without compensation, was organized by authority of Congress in the spring of 1875, and immediately drafted a comprehensive plan for its investigations and contracted for a testing machine of 400 tons capacity, which would enable it to properly conduct the experiments. Meanwhile, the subcommittees of the board have devoted their time to such experiments as could be made with the smaller testing machines already available. This large machine is just now completed and ready for erection at the Watertown Arsenal, and the real labors of the board are therefore just about to be commenced. If the board is to be discontinued at the end of the present fiscal year, the money already appropriated and the services of the gentlemen who have given so much time to the subject will be unproductive of any results. The importance of these experiments can hardly be overestimated when we consider the almost endless variety of purposes for which iron and steel are employed in this country, and the many thousands of lives which daily depend on the soundness of iron structures. I need hardly refer to the recent disaster of the Ashtabula Bridge in Ohio, and the conflicting theories of experts as to the cause of it, as an instance of what might have been averted by a more thorough knowledge of the properties of iron and the best modes of construction. These experiments cannot properly be conducted by private firms, not only on account of the expense, but because the results must rest upon the authority of disinterested persons. They must therefore be undertaken under the sanction of the government. Compared with their great value to the industrial interests of the country, the expense is very slight. The board recommended an appropriation of $40,000 for the next fiscal year, and I earnestly commend their request to the favorable consideration of Congress. I also recommend that the board be required to conduct their investigations under the direction of the Secretary of War, and to make full report of their progress to that officer in time to be incorporated in his annual report. U.S. Grant. Washington, February 2, 1877. To the Senate of the United States. I transmit, in answer to a resolution of the Senate of the 10th ultimo, a report of the Secretary of State with its accompanying papers. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, February 3, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives. By the act of Congress approved January 14, 1875, to provide for the resumption of specie payments, the 1st of January, 1879, is fixed as the date when such resumption is to begin. It may not be desirable to fix an earlier date when it shall actually become obligatory upon the government to redeem its outstanding legal tender notes in coin on presentation, but it is certainly most desirable, and will prove most beneficial to every pecuniary interest of the country, to hasten the day when the paper circulation of the country and the gold coin shall have equal values. At a later day, if currency and coin should retain equal values, it might become advisable to authorize or direct resumption. I believe the time has come when by a simple act of the legislative branch of the government this most desirable result can be attained. I am strengthened in this view by the course trade has taken in the last 2 years, and by the strength of the credit of the United States at home and abroad. For the fiscal year ending June 30, 1876, the exports of the United States exceeded the imports by $120,213,102. But our exports include $40,569,621 of specie and bullion in excess of imports of the same commodities. For the 6 months of the present fiscal year from July 1st, 1876 to January 1st, 1877, the excess of exports over imports amounted to $107,544,869, and the import of specie and bullion exceeded the export of the precious metals by $6,192,147 in the same time. The actual excess of exports over imports for the 6 months, exclusive of specie and bullion, amounted to $113,737,040, showing for the time being the accumulation of specie and bullion in the country amounting to more than $6 millions, in addition to the national product of these metals for the same period. A total increase of gold and silver for the 6 months not far short of $60 millions. It is very evident that unless this great increase of the precious metals can be utilized at home in such a way as to make it in some manner remunerative to the holders, it must seek a foreign market as surely as would any other product of the soil or the manufactory. Any legislation which will keep coin and bullion at home will, in my judgment, soon bring about practical resumption, and will add the coin of the country to the circulating medium, thus securing a healthy inflation of a sound currency, to the great advantage of every legitimate business interest. The act to provide for the resumption of specie payments authorizes the Secretary of the Treasury to issue bonds of either of the descriptions named in the act of Congress approved July 14, 1870, entitled "An Act to Authorize the Refunding of the National Debt," for not less than par in gold. With the present value of the 4.5% bonds in the markets of the world, they could be exchanged at par for gold, thus strengthening the Treasury to meet final resumption and to keep the excess of coin over demand, pending its permanent use as a circulating medium at home. All that would be further required would be to reduce the volume of legal tender notes in circulation. To accomplish this, I would suggest an act authorizing the Secretary of the Treasury to issue 4% bonds, with 40 years to run before maturity, to be exchanged for legal tender notes whenever presented in sums of $50 or any multiple thereof. The whole amount of such bonds, however, not to exceed $150 million. To increase the home demand for such bonds, I would recommend that they be available for deposit in the United States Treasury for banking purposes under the various provisions of law relating to national banks. I would suggest further that national banks be required to retain a certain percentage of the coin interest received by them from the bonds deposited with the Treasury to secure their circulation. I would also recommend the repeal of the third section of the joint resolution for the issue of silver coin, approved July 22, 1876, limiting the subsidiary coin and fractional currency to $50 million. I am satisfied that if Congress will enact some such law as will accomplish the end suggested, they will give a relief to the country instant in its effects, for which they will receive the gratitude of the whole people. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, February 9, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives. The accompanying memorial is transmitted to Congress at the request of a committee composed of many distinguished citizens of New York, recently appointed to cooperate with the generous body of French citizens who design to erect in the harbor of New York a colossal statue of "Liberty enlightening the world." Very little is asked of us to do, and I hope that the wishes of the memorialists may receive your very favorable consideration. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, February 9, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives. I transmit herewith the catalogues and report of the Board on behalf of the executive departments at the International Exhibition of 1876, with their accompanying illustrations. The labors performed by the members of the Board, as evinced by the voluminous mass of information found in the various papers from the officers charged with their preparation, have been in the highest degree commendable, and believing that the publication of these papers will form an interesting memorial of the greatest of international exhibitions and of the centennial anniversary of the independence of our country, I recommend that they be printed in a suitable form for distribution and preservation. The letter of the chairman of the Board will give to Congress the history of its organization, the law and executive orders under which it has acted, and the steps which have been taken to preserve the large and instructive collections made, with a view to their forming a part of a national museum, should Congress make the necessary appropriations for such a desirable object. U.S. Grant. Washington, February 15, 1877. To the Senate of the United States. I transmit herewith, in answer to the resolution of the Senate of the 13th instant, a report from the Secretary of State with accompanying papers. U.S. Grant. Washington, February 23, 1877. To the Senate and House of Representatives. I transmit herewith a report from the Secretary of State, bearing date the 20th instant, with its accompaniments, being the report of the Commissioner of the United States and of the officers of engineers attached to the commission appointed to determine the boundary line between the United States and the possessions of Great Britain from the northwest angle of the Lake of the Woods to the summit of the Rocky Mountains. These reports announce the completion of the labors of this commission, whereby the entire boundary line between the United States and the possessions of Great Britain is marked and determined, except as to that part of the territory of the United States which was ceded by Russia under the Treaty of 1867. U.S. Grant. Washington, February 24, 1877. To the House of Representatives. I transmit herewith, in answer to the resolution of the House of Representatives of the 25th ultimo, a report from the Secretary of State with accompanying papers. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, February 26, 1877. To the Senate of the United States: I have the honor to return herewith Senate Bill No. 234, entitled "An Act to Allow a Pension of $37 per month to soldiers who have lost both an arm and a leg." Under existing law, soldiers who have lost both an arm and a leg are entitled to draw a monthly pension of $18. As the object of this bill is to allow them $18 per month for each of these disabilities, or $36 in all, it is returned simply for an amendment of the title which shall agree with its provisions. When this shall have been done, I will very gladly give it my immediate approval. U.S. Grant. Washington, February 28, 1877. To the Senate of the United States: in answer to the resolution of the Senate of the 27th instant, I transmit herewith a report of the Secretary of State, together with the papers which accompanied it. U.S. Grant. End of chapter 48.
Executive Mansion, March 28, 1872. To the House of Representatives: I herewith return for the further consideration of Congress without my approval House Bill No. 1550, an act for the relief of the estate of Dr. John F. Hanks, for the reason that the records of the Treasury Department show that the current moneys taken by Colonel S.B. Holabird from the Louisiana State Bank of New Orleans in the month of August, 1862, were accounted for by that officer to the Treasury Department, and the names of the depositors given, and that the name of Dr. John F. Hanks does not appear among them. It also appears from the records of the Treasury Department that among the effects taken from the Louisiana State Bank of New Orleans was the sum of $1,729 of Confederate money, and that the said sum stood upon the books of said bank to the credit of J. F. Hanks. It is but justice, however, to the executors of the estate of Dr. Hanks to state that there is every reason to believe that the money deposited by Dr. Hanks in the Louisiana State Bank was in current funds, and that when application was made to Congress for the recovery of the same, they believed, and had evidence to satisfy them, that such funds had found their way into the Treasury of the United States. There has unquestionably been a mistake made, either by the officers of the Louisiana State Bank, or the persons engaged in removing the funds of that bank, by which the estate of Dr. Hanks is loser to the amount of relief afforded by House Bill No. 1550. Accompanying this, I send the statement furnished by the Secretary of the Treasury of the funds covered into his department, and accounted for through it, arising from the seizure of funds of the Louisiana State Bank of New Orleans in the month of August, 1862. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, April 1, 1872. To the House of Representatives: I return herewith for the further consideration of Congress House Bill No. 1867, an act for the relief of James T. Johnston, without my approval, for the reason that the records of the Treasury Department show that the lot sold in the name of J. T. Johnston, situate on Prince Street, Alexandria, Virginia, for taxes due the United States, is numbered 162 instead of 163 as represented in this bill. With the exception of this discrepancy in the number of the lot, there is no reason why the bill should not receive my approval. U.S. Grant. Washington, April 10, 1872. To the House of Representatives: I have received and taken into consideration the bill entitled "An Act for the Relief of the Children of John M. Baker, deceased," and pursuant to the duty required of me by the Constitution, I return the same with my objections to the House of Representatives, in which it originated. The bill proposes to pay a sum of money to the children of John M. Baker, deceased, late United States Consul at Rio Janeiro, for services of that person as acting charge d'affaires of the United States in the year 1834. So far as it can be ascertained, it is apprehended that the bill may have received the sanction of Congress through some inadvertence, for upon inquiry at the proper department it appears that Mr. Baker never did act as charge d'affaires of the United States at Rio Janeiro, and that he was not authorized so to act, but on the contrary was expressly forbidden to enter into diplomatic correspondence with the government of Brazil. The letter of the 8th of February, 1854, a copy of which is annexed, addressed by William L. Marcy, then Secretary of State, to James M. Mason, Chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Senate, specifies objections to the claim, which it is believed have not since diminished, and in which I fully concur. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, April 15, 1872. To the Senate of the United States. I return without my approval an act entitled, "An act granting a pension to Abigail Ryan, widow of Thomas A. Ryan." The name of Mrs. Ryan is now borne upon the pension rolls pursuant to an act of Congress entitled, "An act for the relief of Mrs. Abigail Ryan," approved June 15, 1866. 14 U.S. Statutes at Large, page 590. U.S. Grant. EXECUTIVE MANSION, April 22, 1872. To the House of Representatives: I return herewith House Resolution number 622, entitled "An Act Granting a Pension to Richard B. Crawford," without my approval, for the reason that said Crawford is now drawing a pension as a private soldier, the wound on account of which he was pensioned having been received before his promotion to a lieutenancy. U.S. Grant. EXECUTIVE MANSION, May 14, 1872. To the Senate of the United States: I have the honor to return herewith the bill S. 955, entitled "An Act Granting a Pension to Mary Ann Montgomery, widow of William W. Montgomery, late captain in Texas Volunteers," without my approval, inasmuch as the concluding phrase, "and in respect to her minor children under 16 years of age," has obviously no meaning whatsoever. If it were the intention of the framer of the bill that the pension thereby granted should revert to said minor children upon the remarriage or death of the widow, the phrase referred to should read as follows: "and in the event of her remarriage or death, to her minor children under 16 years of age." I therefore return the bill for proper action. U.S. Grant. Washington, June 1, 1872. To the Senate of the United States: I have examined the bill entitled "An Act for the Relief of J. Milton Best," and being unable to give it my approval, return the same to the Senate, the House in which it originated, without my signature. The bill appropriates the sum of $25,000 to compensate Dr. J. Milton Best for the destruction of his dwelling house and its contents by order of the commanding officer of the United States military forces at Paducah, Kentucky, on the 26th day of March, 1864. It appears that this house was one of a considerable number destroyed for the purpose of giving open range to the guns of a United States fort. On the day preceding the destruction, the houses had been used as a cover for rebel troops attacking the fort, and, apprehending a renewal of the attack, the commanding officer caused the destruction of the houses. This then is a claim for compensation on account of the ravages of war. It cannot be denied that the payment of this claim would invite the presentation of demands for very large sums of money, and such is the supposed magnitude of the claims that may be made against the Government for necessary and unavoidable destruction of property by the Army that I deem it proper to return this bill for reconsideration. It is a general principle of both international and municipal law that all property is held subject not only to be taken by the Government for public uses, in which case under the Constitution of the United States the owner is entitled to just compensation, but also subject to be temporarily occupied or even actually destroyed in times of great public danger and when the public safety demands it, and in this latter case governments do not admit a legal obligation on their part to compensate the owner. The temporary occupation of, injuries to, and destruction of property caused by actual and necessary military operations are generally considered to fall within the last mentioned principle. If a government makes compensation under such circumstances, it is a matter of bounty rather than of strict legal right. If it be deemed proper to make compensation for such losses, I suggest for the consideration of Congress whether it would not be better, by general legislation, to provide some means for the ascertainment of the damage in all similar cases, and thus save to claimants the expense, inconvenience, and delay of attendance upon Congress. and at the same time saved the government from the danger of having imposed upon it fictitious or exaggerated claims, supported wholly by ex parte proof. If the claimant in this case ought to be paid, so ought all others similarly situated, and that there are many such cannot be doubted. Besides, there are strong reasons for believing that the amount of damage in this case has been greatly overestimated. If this be true, it furnishes an illustration of the danger of trusting entirely to ex parte testimony in such matters. U.S. Grant. Executive Mansion, June 7, 1872. To the Senate of the United States. I have the honor to return herewith Senate Bill No. 569, an act entitled "An Act for the Relief of Thomas B. Wallace of Lexington in the State of Missouri," without my approval. This claim, for which $11,250 are appropriated by this bill, is of the same nature and character as the claim of Dr. J. Milton Best, which was returned to the Senate on the 1st instant without my signature. The same reasons which prompted the return of that bill for reconsideration apply in this case, which also is a claim for compensation on account of the ravages of war, and comes under the same general principle of both international and municipal law, that all property is held subject not only to be taken by the Government for public uses, in which case under the Constitution of the United States the owner is entitled to just compensation, but also subject to be temporarily occupied or even actually destroyed in times of great public danger, and when the public safety demands it, and in the latter case governments do not admit a legal obligation on their part to compensate the owner. The temporary occupation of, injuries to, and destruction of property caused by actual and necessary military operations are generally considered to fall within the last mentioned principle, and if a government makes compensation under such circumstances, it is a matter of bounty rather than of strict legal right. If it be deemed proper to make compensation for such losses, I renew my recommendation that provision be made by general legislation for all similar cases. U.S. Grant. End of section 49.
A compilation of the messages and papers of the Presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, by James D. Richardson, Section 50. Proclamation. By the President of the United States of America. A proclamation. Whereas objects of interest to the United States require that the Senate should be convened at 12 o'clock on the 5th day of March next, to receive and act upon such communications as may be made known to it on the part of the Executive. Now therefore I, Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, have considered it to be my duty to issue this, my proclamation, declaring that an extraordinary occasion requires the Senate of the United States to convene for the transaction of business at the Capitol, in the city of Washington, on the 5th day of March next, at 12 o'clock at noon on that day, of which all who shall at that time be entitled to act as members of that body are hereby required to take notice. Given under my hand and the seal of the United States, at Washington, the 2nd day of March, A.D. 1877, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 101st. U.S. Grant. By the President, Hamilton Fish, Secretary of State. End of Section 50. End of A Compilation of the Messages and Papers of the Presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, by James D. Richardson.